Juniper Hallowell was 22 years old and had been told her presence was no longer required in the only house she had ever known. It is a peculiar, hollow feeling to be standing on the windy, high-altitude ridge of Ashe County, North Carolina, looking at a horizon you have memorized since childhood, only to realize that no part of the earth beneath your boots belongs to you anymore. She stood there with a $1 bill tucked into the watch pocket of her denim pants and a spool of linen thread resting in her satchel like a heavy secret. She spent that solitary dollar on an abandoned broom-squire's workshop, a lopsided, vertical plank timber building at the end of a forgotten logging trail that the locals whispered had been reclaimed by the hemlocks and the ghosts of the North Fork. But what nobody in the valley knew, and what the developers from the city could never have guessed, was that beneath the heavy oak winding table in the center of that silent room was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this, stories of the things we keep and the traditions that keep us, mean something to you, hit subscribe. It helps us stay on these quiet roads. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the miles. Juniper's story didn't start with the eviction notice or the cold, biting wind on the ridge. It didn't start with the lawyer's briefcase or her stepbrother Marcus's indifference. It started in the smoke-scented, amber-lit kitchen of her grandmother, Elspeth Hallowell. To the census takers and the tax collectors, Elspeth was just an old woman living on the edge of the timberline. But in the secret history of the Blue Ridge, she was the last true broom-squire of the North Fork. Elspeth didn't just make tools for sweeping. She made what she called clearing ways. She believed with a fierce, quiet conviction that a house was only as healthy as the tool that stood behind its door. She believed that the act of sweeping was the first step in any prayer, a way of telling the world that you were ready to receive whatever the day decided to bring, provided you had cleared the clutter of yesterday first. The Hallowell lineage was tied to the red clay and the high-altitude soil of the Blue Ridge by the broomcorn they grew and the handles they carved from fallen hickory. The lineage stretched back through 6 generations of calloused hands and steady hearts, beginning with a man named Jedediah Hallowell. In the 1840s, Jedediah had crossed the mountains from the coast, carrying nothing but a bag of sorghum vulgar seeds and a specialized ancient knowledge known as the trade of the tension. He understood the physics of the bind, how to marry natural fibers to wood using nothing but wire, weight, and the strength of a rhythmic pulse. No glue was allowed in a Hallowell workshop. No nails were permitted to cheat the tension. It was a trade of absolute integrity. Elspeth had been Jedediah's great-granddaughter, and she had practiced that trade for 62 years, her hands eventually becoming as gnarled, beautiful, and strong as the roots of the mountain laurel that gripped the hillsides. When Juniper was 5 years old, the real lessons began. Elspeth didn't believe in books, and she certainly didn't believe in shortcuts. She believed in the knowing of the palm. She would sit Juniper down on a low, 3-legged stool in the workshop, a place where the air was always thick with the sweet, dusty scent of dried broomcorn and the sharp, clean smell of cedar shavings. Elspeth would hand her a bundle of raw, unworked stalks, the long, golden fibers that would one day be a broom, and tell her to close her eyes. "The world wants you to look with your eyes first, June," Elspeth would say, her voice sounding like the very rustle of the fiber they worked with. But the eyes are easily fooled by a pretty color or a straight line. The eyes want to see the finish before the work is done. You have to look with your skin. You have to feel the moisture content in the stalk. If it's too wet, it will rot beneath the wire and the broom will fail in a year. If it's too dry, it will snap under the tension and you'll have wasted the plant's life. You find the middle, and you find the life of the broom. You find the truth in the fiber. By age 6, Juniper's primary job was the sorting of the brush. It was a task that required the kind of patience most adults have forgotten. She would spend hours at her grandmother's feet, separating the long, fine-seeded ends of the broomcorn, the brush, from the coarse, tough inner stalks. Juniper learned that every single plant had a purpose. The fine, flexible brush was reserved for the whisper brooms, the delicate tools used for ash hearths and silk rugs. The coarse, rigid stalks were for the workhorses, the heavy brooms destined for barn floors and muddy porches. She learned that to disrespect the material was to disrespect the person who would eventually use the tool. She learned that the squire didn't choose the fiber. The fiber told the squire what it wanted to become. By age 8, Juniper was finally allowed to assist with the first wind. This was the most physically demanding and spiritually significant part of the squire's work. They used a massive, hand-cranked winding table, a 300-pound slab of old-growth oak that had been in the Hallowell family since before the Civil War. Juniper would stand on a heavy wooden box so she could reach the wire spool, her job being to hold the tension on the tinned steel wire while Elspeth turned the foot pedal. The wire would hum like a guitar string, a high-pitched, metallic vibration that Juniper could feel in the very marrow of her teeth and the bones of her wrists. "The tension is the truth, child," Elspeth whispered during those long, focused sessions. "You have to feel the bite. If the wire doesn't find the heart of the wood, the broom will fall apart before the first winter is out. We don't make things that fall apart. We make things that outlast the hands that made them. We make things that remember the person who held them. Every broom is a witness to the honesty of the squire. If your tension is loose, your character is loose." At age 10, the curriculum shifted to the squire's knot. This was the final, decorative but essential structural weave of linen twine that finished the shoulders of the broom. It was a complex, interlocking pattern that looked like an intricate braid but functioned like a physical lock. Elspeth insisted it was a symbol of the 3 generations of women: the grandmothers who held the memory, the mothers who held the strength, and the daughters who held the future. Juniper's fingers would often bleed in those early months, the thin, waxed linen twine cutting into her soft skin like a razor. But Elspeth wouldn't let her stop. She would simply rub a bit of pine salve and beeswax on the cuts and tell her to continue. "The twine doesn't care about your pain, June," Elspeth said. "It only cares about the lock. The lock is what survives when the weaver is long gone. The work must be greater than the worker." By age 12, Juniper was sent out into the deep woods alone. Her task was to search for lightning-struck wood. This was a specific Hallowell tradition that dated back to Jedediah. They believed that wood seasoned by the sudden intense heat of a lightning strike had a different vibration, a tempered strength that couldn't be replicated by kiln drying. Juniper would spend days in the deep hemlock stands and hickory groves, looking for the telltale scorched scars and spiral patterns on fallen timber. She learned to identify wood by its bark in the dead of winter. She learned how to use a draw knife with such precision that she could peel away the outer layers to reveal the smooth, hard heartwood beneath. Wood as white as bone and as tough as iron. She learned that a handle wasn't just a stick. It was the spine of the house, and it had to be strong enough to carry the weight of a family's cleanliness. Elspeth used to tell her stories during the long, humid afternoons while they sat on the porch, their fingers moving in a blur of sorting. She told her about the year of the long dust in 1932. The winds had been so fierce that the topsoil from the Midwestern plains had been carried all the way to the Blue Ridge, settling like a gray, suffocating shroud over everything, blocking out the sun for days at a time. "We didn't have much to eat that year," Elspeth said, her hands never stopping. "The crops failed, and the livestock were coughing from the dust. But we had the most beautiful broomcorn harvest we'd ever seen. It was like the earth knew we needed to sweep the sky. We made 400 brooms that year. We didn't sell them for a penny. We traded them for flour and eggs and salt. We swept the threshold every hour, June. Not because of the dirt, but because the sweeping reminded us that we still owned the ground we stood on. It reminded us that the dust couldn't take our names. Every stroke of the broom was a way of saying, 'We are still here. We are not buried yet.' A clean floor is a victory over despair." Then there was the story of the wedding sweep. Elspeth told her about a broom she had made for a young bride in 1954. It was a beautiful piece, tied with crimson silk thread and a handle of white ash. A mountain lion had broken into the bride's cabin while she was away and dragged the broom into the woods, likely attracted by the smell of the raw fiber. 3 years later, the bride's husband found the broom in a lion's den 2 miles away. The silk was gone and the handle was chewed, but the squire's knot, the Hallowell lock, was still holding the stalks in place as tight as the day it was wound. A good trade is a promise made to the material, Elspeth would say, her eyes reflecting the golden afternoon light. And a Hallowell promise doesn't break for a beast, and it doesn't break for time. It is a bond between the tree and the hand. If you make a promise with your hands, the world has to listen. You never put your name on a piece of work that you wouldn't stand behind in a storm. By the time Juniper was 15, Elspeth began to take her to the leaning workshop at the far edge of the property. It was a vertical plank building, silvered by a century of mountain weather. It had belonged to Elspeth's brother Silas, who had been a master squire but a reclusive man who felt that people were too messy, and wood was just right. Silas was a squire of the old school, Elspeth had said. He didn't use the foot pedals. He used his own body weight to provide the tension. He said a machine could never feel the wood the way a man's own muscles could. When he died in the 70s, he told me the workshop would wait for the one who knew how to feel the tension. He knew the building wouldn't fall as long as the trade was alive. The wood knows when it is being used with respect, and it holds up the roof in return. The teenage years were spent in deep, exhausting apprenticeship. Every Saturday morning from the age of 15 to 18 was dedicated to a specific type of broom. 1 month it was the whisk, a small, delicate tool that required the finest, most flexible broomcorn. Another month it was the shaker flat, which required a specialized heavy sewing vise to flatten the head into a broad, sweeping surface. Juniper learned how to dye the stalks using natural walnut husks and goldenrod, creating deep, permanent earth tones that looked like the forest floor. She learned how to cure the handles in a smokehouse, making them resistant to the rot of the damp mountain air. Elspeth was a hard teacher. If a broom wasn't perfect, she would make Juniper take a pair of shears and cut the wire, letting the fiber fall to the floor in a heap. If you send a lie out into the world, it will eventually find its way back to you, Elspeth would say. A broom with a loose wind is a lie told to the person who has to clean their home. It tells them that the worker didn't care about their piece. Start again. Feel the tension. Be honest with the wire. The relationship was one of quiet, shared labor. They would work for 6 or 7 hours without speaking, the only sound being the rustle of the broomcorn and the high-pitched metallic hum of the winding wire. Juniper grew to love that silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of the work. She learned that a person could say more with a well-tied knot than they ever could with 1,000 words. She learned that her grandmother's love wasn't expressed in hugs or soft words, but in the correction of a grip, the sharpening of a blade, and the demand for perfection. Elspeth passed away on a crisp, silent morning in late October, just as the frost was beginning to turn the hemlocks to silver. Juniper found her in the garden, her hand resting on a bundle of harvested broomcorn she had been preparing for the winter. She was 89 years old. She had outlived her husband, her siblings, and her own daughter, Juniper's mother. Elspeth had been the sun around which Juniper's entire world orbited. With her gone, the gravity of the mountain felt different. It felt like it was trying to push her off the ridge. Within a month of the funeral, the stepbrother arrived. Marcus was a man who lived in the city and saw the Blue Ridge only as a place to develop luxury vacation rentals for people who didn't know the difference between a hickory and a hemlock. He arrived with a lawyer and a briefcase. He informed Juniper that the main house and the surrounding acreage were being sold. He looked at the broom-making tools with a mixture of pity and disgust. As if they were relics of a primitive age, that had no place in a modern world of plastic and convenience. "You're 22, June," Marcus had said, his voice flat and practical, devoid of any mourning for the woman who had raised them. "You can't spend your life making straw brushes in a shed. The world has moved on. There's no money in tradition. I'm giving you 48 hours to clear out. I've settled the taxes and the rest is mine. You should go find a real job in the city. Maybe you can answer phones or work in a store. Just don't expect the mountain to feed you." Juniper left with her canvas satchel, her spool of linen thread, her grandmother's favorite draw knife, and a single-dollar bill she had found tucked into the back of Elspeth's favorite pattern book, the Jedediah Chronicles from 1845. She had nowhere to go, no car, and no plan. She spent 3 nights sleeping in the back of a hay barn on a neighbor's property, her fingers tracing the patterns in the old book by the light of a small flashlight, the cold seep of the mountain air a constant reminder of her new reality. She felt like a ghost in her own hometown. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever felt like an old tradition was calling you home, even when everything else was falling apart? Juniper was sitting in the back of the local laundromat in West Jefferson, trying to stay warm as the machines hummed and clattered around her, when she saw a yellowed legal notice pinned to the corkboard. It was a listing for a derelict workshop on a 1-acre parcel at the end of the old logging road. It had been tied up in a boundary dispute for 40 years, and the county was offering a quitclaim deed for exactly $1 to anyone who would assume the liability and pay the nominal processing fee. She walked the 2 miles to the county building, her scuffed leather boots clicking on the cold linoleum. The clerk was a woman named Mrs. Weaver, who had used an Elspeth Hallowell broom to sweep her porch for 20 years and considered it a member of the family. Mrs. Weaver didn't ask for a credit check or a bank statement. She looked at Juniper's honey-blonde hair and her steel-blue eyes that looked exactly like the woman who had once taught the whole valley the meaning of a clean threshold. "The workshop is in bad shape, June," Mrs. Weaver said, her voice soft and full of concern. "The forest has tried its best to swallow it, but the timber in that place is old growth. It's got a long memory, and Silas was a man who built things to stay. He didn't believe in the temporary." She stamped the deed and handed Juniper a heavy rusted iron key. "Go on now. Don't let the wind take the Hallowell name. You go and you sweep that place clean. Show them the dust doesn't win." The walk to the workshop was a grueling climb. The logging road had been reclaimed by the forest, and Juniper had to navigate by the landmarks Elspeth had taught her, the split rock spring and the leaning pine that pointed the way to the high ridge. When she finally reached the clearing, the workshop looked like a ghost standing in the mist. The vertical planks were silvered and thin, and the building seemed to be leaning against the trees for support. Yet there was a stubbornness in its frame that the years hadn't managed to break. She pushed the door open. The air inside was surprisingly dry, smelling of ancient dust, cedar, and the ghost of harvested grain. In the center of the room sat the winding table, a massive slab of oak bolted into the floor joists. It stood like an altar in the middle of a cathedral of shadows. Juniper remembered Elspeth talking about Silas's trade of the weight. She walked to the table and ran her hand over the surface. It was scarred with 1,000 wire grooves. She noticed something strange as the afternoon sun hit the floor at a low angle. The table wasn't just bolted down. The floorboards directly beneath the central oak pedestal were fitted together with a complex tongue and groove joint that formed a specific geometric pattern. It was the pattern of a squire's knot carved into the floor by a master hand. She knelt in her denim work pants, her heart hammering. She used her draw knife handle to lever the boards. They didn't snap or splinter. They slid with a precision that was almost musical, a hidden mechanism designed to wait for the right hands. Beneath the winding table was a cavity lined with cedar and charcoal to keep the contents dry and safe from the mountain damp. Inside sat a heavy iron lockbox and a smaller wooden box containing a set of hand-forged needles, 10-inch steel spikes used for sewing the flat head brooms. These were Silas's personal tools, forged to his own specifications. Juniper opened the iron box first. Inside, wrapped in thick oilcloth that had preserved them for 40 years, were stacks of $20 gold eagles, dated between 1890 and 1910. She counted them slowly, her fingers trembling. There were 42 coins. At today's value, it was over $21,000. But it was the letter in the wooden box, resting atop the needles, that changed the temperature of the air in the room and filled Juniper's heart with a purpose she hadn't felt since Elspeth passed. To the squire who holds the tension. The letter read, the ink dark and clear. My name is Silas Hallowell. If you are reading this, the world has likely forgotten what a clean floor means. They have forgotten that the dirt we sweep is the doubt we carry. These coins were my weight. I kept them under the table so that when I wound the wire, the table would never budge, no matter how hard I pulled. I needed the weight of history to make a tool for the future. I needed the gold to keep the oak steady. But the trade is not in the gold. The gold is just weight. The trade is in these needles. Use them to sew the flat rows. A round broom is for a porch, but a flat broom is for a home. Don't let the wind take the Hallowell name. If you have the tension in your hands, you have the world in your heart. You are the weight now. Signed, Silas Hallowell, Squire. Juniper did not cry. She didn't let a single tear fall. Instead, she took a bundle of broomcorn that had been sitting on a shelf for 40 years, perfectly preserved by the dry air. She ran her palm over the dry stalks until the rustling sound matched her breathing, a deep, rhythmic sigh of arrival. I'm here, Uncle Silas, she whispered into the silence of the room. The table won't move. I promise you that. I'm the weight now. The next morning, Juniper walked back into West Jefferson. She went to the bank first. The teller's eyes went wide as Juniper laid out the gold coins. But the paperwork from the county was in order, and the Hallowell name still carried weight in that county, a currency more valuable than the gold itself. After leaving the bank, she walked to a small used car lot on the highway. She bought a forest green 1996 Ford Ranger with a manual transmission and a heavy ladder rack. It had 112,000 miles on it and a heater that worked well enough to fight off the mountain chill. She paid $1,900 cash. It was the first thing she had ever owned, and as she shifted the gears, she felt a sense of autonomy that was intoxicating. The restoration began immediately. The first month was spent entirely on the winding table. She spent every daylight hour stripping the old, gummy grease from the foot pedal and polishing the oak top with raw beeswax until it shone like honey in the afternoon light. She had to replace the tensioning spring, which she did using a part she found in a salvage yard in Boone. She learned the specific creak of the machine, the way the oak table spoke when the wire hit the perfect tension. She replaced the rotted shingles on the roof with hand-split hickory shakes, learning the rhythm of the hammer as the mountain winter approached. The work was hard, but it was healing. She was no longer just Juniper, she was a Hallowell squire in training. She sourced her materials like a scavenger. She found a stack of seasoned hickory branches at a neighbor's woodlot after a storm, trading a future broom for the right to haul them away. She bought her first real supply of fresh broomcorn from a farm auction in Virginia, paying $80 for enough fiber to make her first 50 brooms. She wasn't alone for long. A man named Abner, who ran the local hardware store and had been a friend of Silas's, stopped by one afternoon in his battered old truck. He brought a roll of tinned steel wire and a bag of crisp mountain apples. Silas always said the girl with the honey-blonde hair would come back for the needles, Abner said, leaning against the doorframe and looking at the winding table with a nod of approval. I reckon he saw the tension in you before you even knew what it was. You're doing good work, June. The valley needs a squire. My wife's been complaining about those plastic brushes for a decade. She says they don't have no soul." Abner helped her rig a new tensioning system, and he became a recurring visitor. Every Tuesday, he would stop by with a small gift: a new file for her draw knife, a jar of honey, or just the local news. His presence made the workshop feel like part of the world again, a thread tied back into the community. The homemaking was a slow, deliberate process. She cleared the briars from the clearing, revealing a small, stone-lined well that still held sweet, cold water. She scrubbed the interior walls with vinegar and salt, removing decades of grime until the silver-gray wood began to glow. She built a small kitchen area in the corner with a cast-iron wood stove she found at a yard sale for $40. The first night Juniper spent in the workshop after the roof was finished was the first night she truly slept in years. She had built a small loft bed above the dye station. She listened to the wind howling through the hemlocks, but the building didn't lean any more. She felt the weight of the oak table below her, and she felt the presence of Elspeth and Silas in the very grain of the walls. The building smelled of wood smoke and dry grain, a scent she now recognized as the smell of safety. She placed Elspeth's photograph on a small shelf she carved from a piece of lightning-struck hickory. She hung the steel needles on a magnetic strip above the table, and she kept Silas's letter tucked into the frame of the window. She was no longer a leaf caught in a draft. She was the tree itself, rooted deep in the Blue Ridge soil. The restoration of the workshop was more than just physical labor. It was a sensory immersion. Juniper spent hours each day in a specific rhythm. In the mornings, she would gather wood for the stove, the crisp mountain air filling her lungs. Then, she would spend the afternoon at the winding table. The sound of the wire was her constant companion, a sharp, metallic song that changed pitch depending on the thickness of the broomcorn. She learned to read the tension through her feet on the pedal, feeling the resistance of the oak table like a heartbeat. She also began to experiment with natural dyes, just as Elspeth had taught her. She gathered walnut hulls from the trees along the creek, boiling them in a large copper pot until the water turned a deep, rich brown. She soaked the broomcorn stalks in the dye, watching as they absorbed the color of the earth. She used goldenrod for a bright, sunny yellow and madder root for a deep, dusty rose. Her workshop became a gallery of color, the bundles of dyed fiber hanging from the rafters like inverted sunsets. In her second year, the business began to take shape. She got a job from a boutique in Asheville that had heard about the broom-squire of Ashe County. They commissioned a dozen wedding sweeps, brooms with handles of white oak and silk-woven shoulders. She spent a month on that order, her hands moving with a precision that surprised even her. She realized that the tension she felt in her hands was the same tension Silas had written about, the strength to hold on when the world wanted to pull apart. Community reputation began to spread by word of mouth. Neighbors would stop by with their old plastic brooms and ask if she could make them something real. They would stay for a cup of coffee and a story, their voices filling the workshop with a warmth it hadn't known in 40 years. She charged $30 for a daily broom and $45 for a flat-sewn floor broom. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a life of dignity. It was a trade that commanded respect, and she was the one who held the needles. One Saturday, a woman named Mrs. Gable brought in a broom that had been made by Silas 30 years ago. The handle was worn smooth by decades of use, but the squire's knot was still as tight as the day it was wound. "Can you mend the brush?" Mrs. Gable asked, her eyes searching Juniper's. Juniper spent 3 hours carefully rewinding the fiber, feeling Silas's original tension beneath her own fingers. It was a conversation across time, a handshake with a ghost. The workshop became a hub for the valley. People would come not just for brooms but for the sense of history that Juniper had restored. She began to host small workshops on the weekends, teaching the local children the basics of the trade of the tension. She wanted them to understand that their heritage wasn't just something in a book. It was something they could hold in their hands and use to keep their homes. She remembered a specific afternoon in the 3rd year. A young girl, no older than 7, was trying to sort the brush. Her small hands were struggling with the coarse stalks. Juniper sat down beside her and told her the story of the year of the long dust. She saw the girl's eyes light up with the realization that she was part of something bigger than herself. In that moment, Juniper knew that Elspeth's legacy was safe. The seasons in the Blue Ridge have a way of anchoring a person to the earth. The winters are harsh and silent, the mountains buried in snow. Juniper spent those months in the workshop, the wood stove her only source of warmth and light. She would sit by the fire and draft new patterns in the old Hallowell book, her mind constantly exploring the possibilities of the fiber. The summers are humid and vibrant, the air thick with the sound of cicadas and the smell of honeysuckle. She would harvest her own broomcorn in the small clearing, the tall stalks waving like golden flags in the breeze. She also became a guardian of the forest. She worked with local conservation groups to identify and protect the old-growth hickory and oak stands that were the source of her handles. She understood that her trade depended on the health of the land, and she took that responsibility seriously. She became a forest reader, able to tell the age and health of a tree just by the sound the wind made through its leaves in different seasons. On a clear, copperlit evening in late October of her 4th year, Juniper sat on the threshold of her workshop. The forest-green Ford Ranger was parked in the clearing, loaded with brooms for the weekend market. The smoke from her small potbelly stove rose straight into the still air, a signal of life and work in the deep woods. She looked out at the ridge where she had stood 4 years ago, homeless and alone. The wind was still there, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like an invitation to keep going. The meditation on the trade had become her daily practice, her way of staying centered. She realized that the trade of the tension wasn't just a physical requirement for making a broom. It was a philosophy for living a meaningful life. To hold the tension was to remain steady in the face of change. It was to bind the past to the present with enough strength to face the future without breaking. She understood that her grandmother hadn't just been teaching her a craft. She had been teaching her a way of being in the world. That's the thing about the brooms our grandmothers teach us to tie. We do not always know, when we are 6 years old and sorting broomcorn stalks on a kitchen floor, that the sorting is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, stalk by stalk, tension by tension. We learn that the tool is only as good as the spirit of the one who made it. We learn that the beauty of a thing is in its function and the honesty of its construction. And then, years after the old woman dies, we lift a floorboard beneath a winding table, and we understand what she had been teaching us all along. She had been teaching us that a broom does not just move the dust. It sets the intention for the threshold. It tells the world that someone lives here, someone cares about the order of things, and someone is keeping the clearing way open against the darkness. It is an act of defiance against the chaos and the indifference of the world. She had been teaching us that the tension isn't just in the wire, it's in the heart. It's the will to keep the home clean, to keep the doubt at bay, to make a promise with your hands that doesn't break for time or beast. Juniper Hallowell was 22 years old and kicked out. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned broom-squire's workshop in Ashe County. She discovered that she wasn't just buying a building. She was reclaiming her soul and securing her future. She was the squire now, and as long as she held the needles and felt the tension, the Hallowell name would never be taken by the wind. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories, never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full Quiet Road story, just like this one. There is also a full audiobook available for the people who want to listen to all 12 in one place. You will find the link in the bio. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next quiet road.